Good morning. Hello, everybody. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonas Nölle to the Baltic School, Summer School of Digital Humanities today. Jonas is a linguist and a cognitive scientist and a semiotician, I believe, who has studied in Berlin, Aarhus, and Edinburgh. In Aarhus, he was also working in the Interacting Minds project. In Edinburgh, he did a PhD at the Centre for Language Evolution, where he quite literally pioneered the usage of virtual reality technology for the study of language evolution in the lab. And even before he finished his PhD, he was already hired as a postdoc in the face syntax research group at Glasgow University, where he's working now. I think that's it for me. I'll just give it over to Jonas.
Thank you very much. Today I want to talk about virtual reality, which is kind of a tool that I discovered at the beginning of my PhD. And during my PhD, I used it as a means to an end because I needed to kind of create virtual environments for what I wanted to study. But I realized that it actually can offer much, much more to all kinds of different scientific disciplines. So what I want to talk about here is kind of presenting this method. And when I thought about how I'm going to start this talk, I thought about how I first actually learned about virtual reality. And for a very long time, it was actually mainly science fiction. So when I was a kid, I was reading science fiction novels, and there was actually one novel called Otherland, where there were researchers using virtual reality to build environments that they would study. But back then, of course, it was just pure science fiction. Or you might have seen Star Trek, where they have this holodeck where they can actually create whatever environment they want and then immerse themselves in it. And the crazy thing is that now this is actually not science fiction anymore, it's reality. We can actually use this to study different virtual environments in the lab. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the kind of hardware and technology that is around nowadays and readily available to do this. Then I'm going to talk a bit about why virtual reality makes sense to use in experiments. I will talk about experimental control and ecological validity, the combination of which I think is unprecedented in virtual reality. And then I will give you some examples of applications in research across various disciplines before I then talk about my own work in language evolution, where I also applied VR. And finally, if there's time, I will show you how to build your own VR experiments. Since this is a summer school, I kind of want to give you a short primer on if you wanted to use this technology. All right, to kind of start, just to tell you what kind of hardware is around nowadays. So for a long time, virtual reality research was really expensive and difficult. It has already started in the 90s and early 2000s. If you go to neuroscience papers or psychology, some labs actually had some equipment and they started exploring this kind of research. But even 10 years later, you would still find quotes in review papers like immersive systems, head-mounted devices are still extremely expensive. And they used to cost like 100,000 euros. To equip your lab with just some glasses that you can use, and it was very difficult to program them as well. However, in the last 4 or 5 years, this really changed with the advent of kind of consumer-ready virtual reality. So now we have technology like the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift that you can basically buy on Amazon if you want. And there are also headsets for all kinds of applications. Like if you want to have very, very good resolution or a wide field of vision, there are specific headsets for that, or also more affordable headsets like the Samsung Gear or the Google Cardboard, where you can just put a phone into a cardboard box and you can still get 3 degrees of freedom, for example, to watch 360-degree videos and so on. And while I started with the HTC Vive on the left here, in the beginning of my PhD, there's also now updated beta versions. There's also the Oculus Quest where you don't need a computer, a separate one. It can by itself run VR applications. And there are also all kinds of improved controllers that now can even track individual fingers with certain touch sensors or even gloves, which allows you to basically interact with the virtual world. So you're not just presented there, but you can actually press buttons and interact with the things that are presented to you in the VR. There are also a lot of accessories available now. So if you didn't just want to track head movement or hands, you can also now put sensors on other body parts to kind of map the whole human body on an avatar. So depending on what you're studying, this might become relevant. And to increase movement, you can also use wireless adapters or put the computer in some kind of backpack so that people can move around freely without being entangled in cords. And there are now even these treadmills, so you can have people physically walk and then project them into an VR where they explore. So there are basically no limits to what you can do with this. And there's, at the same time, of course, now a lot of software. So it's mainly used in the game industry, but you can see here there's also applications like virtual desktop where you can just use your computer inside of VR. So you can display windows wherever you want. Or there are creative applications like Tilt Brush where you can paint or you can design architecture and so on. And what's really nice about this is that due to this wide applicability across commercial markets, there are now these 3D engines and packages that are specifically for developing VR content, like game engines and specific plugins like VRTK or Steam VR that make it very easy to develop VR. So it has become much more accessible. Now I want to talk a bit about why is this relevant for researchers. So it's nice to play around with that, of course, but why is this relevant for us if we want to, specifically people who want to study human behavior? And here I want to talk about experimental control and ecological validity. So if you think about ecological validity, usually what people talk about is the difference between internal and external validity of experiments. So if you're conducting research, usually internal validity refers to the experimental truth. So what you basically, if you're designing an experiment, you want to make sure that what you're measuring is really what you're measuring. You want to usually isolate a specific variable, test the effect of X on Y. And usually we use control and randomization of trials and so on to make sure that we're really measuring what we want to measure and we're then using the right statistical test. But this, of course, is only assuring that the experiment is valid. But there's also external validity, which is essentially the truth in the real world. You also want that your experiment basically says something about the real world and actually describes some real phenomenon, right? And this is where ecological validity comes in. It's basically how natural or how applicable to the real world an experiment is. So in ecological validity, you want your experiment to be representative in the sense that the phenomenon that you study actually corresponds to the phenomenon in the real world, and your findings are also generalizable in the sense that the degree to which experimental results can be generalized to the real world, that they are actually applicable to how the phenomenon occurs in the real world. And this is usually understood as kind of on one opposing end to experimental control. So if you want to have very high ecological validity, usually people think that you have to sacrifice experimental control. So if you're, for example, doing ethnographic work or anthropological field work, if you want to really understand a phenomenon, you would use things like ethnographic observations or in linguistics, conversational analysis, where you just film people in their natural environment using language naturally. But then this doesn't give you a lot of experimental control, right? It's very difficult to measure specific variables and ask or test specific hypotheses with data sets like that. So if people want experimental control, then usually they sacrifice ecological validity and they use much more let's say, abstract tasks, like, for example, picture naming, where you're just presented with certain trials on a computer screen and then you just produce a word and then researchers measure that. Or in psychology, reaction time paradigms are very widely used, where people just press buttons very quickly. But this is, of course, extremely removed from how we normally behave in our daily lives. And this is why we consider this to sacrifice ecological validity. However, what I want to argue here is, together with some other researchers that have said that, like Peters, that in reality, these two facets of experimental design are actually not the ends of continuum, but rather two orthogonal aspects. And in fact, there are paradigms like using immersive virtual reality that combine very high experimental control with very high ecological validity. And the reason for this is that if you're in VR, you're basically not artificially removed from the stimuli. It's not just things being presented on an abstract screen, but rather you're immersed, and it allows for the full representing the full dynamics of basically everyday human behavior in its full richness, its full modality with gesture, speech, and everything present. And at the same time, you can track everything that happens. You can track where people look, how they move, you can measure their position, and you can also control everything that happens in the world, what they interact with, what they see. So it's basically like using the real world, but in a controlled way. So there are also some other advantages to VR. It's particularly useful to study embodied or spatial phenomena, obviously, because you're in a space. So things like deixis, personhood, perspective taking, multimodality. You can also combine it with virtual agents, so presenting participants with virtual characters that are usually more reliable than confederates, than using, for example, an experimenter. You can use them as a stand-in for that and control that every participant really encounters the same person, so to say. And now, as I mentioned before, there's this large variety of consumer hardware available that is quite affordable and also relatively easy to program and use with these modern 3D engines and scripting languages that are not much different from what researchers nowadays use to, for example, analyze the data or visualize the data. And finally, I think VR is actually really good also for cross-cultural or demographic studies because these headsets are very mobile. You can take them to the field, so you can even do it in different communities or field sites, and the controls are very intuitive. So even if you're working with older people or with cultures that are normally not exposed to computers and like using a mouse, for example, they find it much more intuitive to just be in a VR and touch things in a way that feels much more real. And just to show you some examples of how a virtual avatar can look like that you interact with, this is an example of an augmented reality study where they're actually projecting, using the HoloLens glasses over here, an avatar into the real world in the lab. And then this can be an agent that gives the participant certain prompts, for example. Or in my current lab, what we do is I study how, for example, facial expressions and speech relate to each other. And we're using these virtual agents like the one over here, where we can actually animate every specific muscle in the face to produce specific facial expressions. So here in this case, for example, it's just an example of how we can animate an eyebrow raiser. And with this, we can kind of create very complex stimuli that talk and at the same time produce exactly the facial expressions that we want, which is something that you couldn't very easily do with a researcher, right? You would have someone who's a trained actor who can actually control every muscle in their face, and they would have to produce the exact same amount of movement on every trial, which is impossible. And so for this, actually using a virtual avatar is really useful. So to show you some applications across various research fields in which VR has been used, starting with learning and education. For example, in language learning, it has been found that, I mean, if you learned a language ever in your life, you might know this, that it's much easier if you actually use the language, if you learn it as you're using it in like an actual embodied, situated environment. And so VR actually provides these situated learning conditions where the experiences are actually through perception and action. And so people have, for example, taught their participants languages in cooking settings or walking through a zoo, learning animal names and so on. And it has been shown that this really helps the learning experience and improves performance on testing. Similarly, VR has a long tradition in spatial cognition research, again, obviously because you can actually simulate spaces and then see how navigation works or memory of specific areas. And in this review paper, you can nicely see the different types of virtual environments that have been used. So you can, for example, present participants simply with a computer screen and a virtual environment projected on that, or you can make it more immersive by using a large screen, in this case combined with an eye tracker, or you can put them on a treadmill so they can actually explore that screen. And then the state of the art is, of course, an immersive headset where they're inside the world that you're interested in. And this has even been applied to study how animals find their ways, for example. So there have been lots of studies, with rodents, as well as flies, mice, and even fish that have been put in kind of virtual environments to study how they remember places and like measure which brain areas are active and so on. Similarly, in psychology, we can study all kinds of phenomena related to cognition and perception using virtual environments like problem solving, mental imagery, memory, or visual attention, where you can also use where the headset is facing to know where people are looking and then kind of gather data on their attention. In clinical settings, it has been used, for example, in rehabilitation and therapy. This is a study on Parkinson that actually found that after 6 weeks of training in VR, the gait and balance of Parkinson patients improves significantly. Or another study on autistic children that used virtual environments where the children interacted with certain avatars and they had to learn emotional responses in order to kind of improve their emotional abilities. And this is another study where it was used, where they used virtual objects for pain rehabilitation or pain therapy. And finally, in clinical settings, it can also be used for simulation, for example, simulating difficult surgeries so that people can actually practice them. What I also really like is the applications in architecture, where you can, for example, have people explore a neighborhood as you design it to actually see if it makes sense in order to, basically move your way around, or you can even rebuild buildings in the VR that you want to build or that already exist to see what works and what doesn't work so well. I really also like this study that looked into behavior in kind of high stress environments. If you think about mass panics, this is like a big problem when you have crowds. And it's not something that you can usually study with humans in the lab. Usually people would use computational models because it's unethical to put a lot of people into a mass panic situation. But with VR, they actually managed to create low stress and high stress environments. And then the people were real people, but just projected into the VR. So the stress felt real, but there could be no harm. And it was still ethical to conduct this research. And they found, for example, here that how they cluster much more in this high stress situation. So VR really enables you to study things that you could normally not study in the lab, simply because it would not be possible. It would put your participants at risk. And there are many more fields that I can't go through all of them, like, for example, market research or art and creative software. You might have seen these days, if you go to art galleries, there are lots of installations using virtual reality. You can also use it for scientific visualization or data exploration. If you have very complex data, let's say, in this case, it's like molecular data, protein folding, but even if you're a linguist, you have a huge data set of words that you want to explore in 3 dimensions, and you can actually go into the data set. And it's quite nice for particularly these complex cases. Okay, I want to talk about the language sciences now, actually, because this is kind of my area. And there it has especially been used because VR can kind of provide you with a more realistic face-to-face interaction situation than more traditional experiments. So in this study by Peters, for example, they were interested in bilingual language switching. And traditionally in bilingualism studies, people have used just prompts on the computer, that kind of where you get a prompt, now switch your language. And this, of course, is not how it usually works if you like fluidly switch in daily interactions. So in this case, they actually used artificial agents that had to be addressed in different languages, and they had to actually talk about these objects on the table and so on, so creating a much more naturalistic setting. And similarly, in this study, they try to verify psycholinguistic findings about certain brain potentials that are active when you speak, by also not just giving them like very abstract sentences, but actually providing them with sentences that were spoken by avatars in a rich environment. And they could verify that actually the same potentials were found in the brain, showing that this is actually something that has ecological validity. And like this is how the brain processes language in the real world. Okay, and now I want to talk about my own research. And this was basically my PhD that I finished last year in Edinburgh. And in the Center for Language Evolution, we studied kind of the cultural evolution of language, and I was specifically interested in spatial language and these what is called frames of reference. So in specific languages, there are different ways of talking about space. So if you have a scene like this, you could, for example, use a geocentric frame of reference and say the ball is downhill of the car. So you're using, it's called geocentric or allocentric because it's environment-based. You're using environmental properties to relate the figure to the ground, the ball to the car. But you could also say something like the ball is to the right of the car, and this would be the egocentric solution because it relies on your relative viewpoint, right? It would change if you're on the other side, then the ball would be left of the car. So it's relative rather than egocentric, rather than geocentric or absolute. And this has been interesting to cognitive scientists because specific languages seem to prefer one or the other frame of reference. And this seems to have also some consequences on the speakers. So if you speak a relative language like English or German, probably Estonian as well, and you're asked to memorize these three objects on a table and then turn around and reproduce them, then people using a relative language will do it like this, so they will remember them in relation to themselves, whereas absolute speakers would produce something like this. They remember the objects with relation to absolute space. And so this has been very interesting, and there are loads of papers on how this might relate to the relation of language and thought, but what I'm generally interested in as an evolutionary linguist is why do languages make these different choices? Where do these different systems come from? And just eyeballing 21 languages in 2004, Majid et al. Concluded there doesn't seem to be any simple determinism, like where these languages are spoken or what the subsistence mode of these speakers is and so on. They didn't find a clear correlation between some environmental property, for example. So they thought maybe it's just like a random cultural choice. But if you look into the environments where, for example, geocentric systems are used, there usually seem to be very salient environmental cues like rivers or mountains that seem to make it easy to use like these uphill, downhill, or upstream, downstream systems, for example. So, for example, here by Bonemeyer et al., they found that in Mesoamerican languages like Tzeltal, which is spoken in Mexico, and they use this uphill, downhill, and across distinction. If you go to different villages, the same words for uphill, downhill, and across, they vary slightly with the direction that you have to use them in respect to, depending on the local topography, so the actual slopes of the actual mountains there. But they found it very hard to predict whether people prefer the geocentric or the egocentric frame based on just the topography, because there were also other variables like how literate they were, how population dense the specific village was, or whether there was contact with another language like Spanish. So it's very difficult to disentangle all these different factors. Here's some other set of studies that looked at atoll languages. So atolls are very interesting environments because you have this collection of islands with a laguna on the inside and the open ocean on the outside. And on unrelated languages from different families that are spoken on atolls, you often find a geocentric system where they say something like lagoon-ward and ocean-ward, and it changes where you are on the islands. So you have to keep track of that. And what they found is that this exists particularly on islands that are found on atolls. If you go to islands that are not part of the atoll, you find more of the egocentric system here in red. And there's also this interesting interaction, for example, with fishing versus non-fishing islands, where if people interact more with water on the fishing island, they also use more of this geocentric system. And on the far right, you can even see a kind of expat community of Marshallese speakers. So Marshallese normally spoken on the Marshall Islands. This is a community in Springdale, Arkansas in the US, and you can see they almost entirely use the egocentric system. And the egocentric system, if you think about it, it might seem like the default to us, but actually it turns out, if you think about it, it's actually a weird system in the sense of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. Usually it's found in these kind of post-industrial societies, and if you go to, for example, our closest relatives, the great apes, they actually prefer the geocentric system, and also young children. It's much easier for children to learn a geocentric system rather than arbitrary left-right. You might remember yourself that it's actually quite difficult. And so the question is, why is the left-right, the egocentric system, so successful in cultural evolution? This is basically what I've been interested in, also as part of my PhD topic. And there are various hypotheses. For example, you could say that it's more flexible or universally applicable. If you think about it, it's not dependent on a specific environmental cue like a mountain to be present and so on. So it might be really useful in our kind of modern urban environments, and also particularly for cultural practices like driving. So in a study where they looked at Marshallese speakers in Springdale, they found, for example, that when they are driving and while they're talking in the car in Marshallese, they would still use the English terms of left and right while they're talking about what they're doing, which is turning left and right turns on the street, right? So it's really useful in this particular setting. So perhaps it has evolved to fit this need. And another idea from Bornemeyer is that it could also have to do with the importance of small-scale space. So as humans started using tools and moving into enclosures and gathering lots of objects, perhaps we started having these kind of tabletop spaces with lots of things, and it might be easier to talk about the relations of these objects with left and right. And then when you have language contact, this innovation of using this egocentric system overrides the geocentric system, because in our modern cultures it's just much more useful. However, the preference of whether you use egocentric or geocentric is still very difficult to kind of disentangle, like what the driving cultural or environmental variables are. So all these different variables like gender, literacy, age, and so on have been put forward. And basically any of these, if any of these were true, it would be a case of linguistic adaptation where the language kind of tries to fit the communicative need. So the idea of linguistic adaptation is that aspects of the environment can actually motivate or shape language, and it can be the social, the physical, or even the technological environment. Like, for example, books, you get much longer sentences than we would produce in speech because you can actually reread and so on. So this would be like a technological adaptation. And there have been now lots of correlations that have been found in the literature between kind of linguistic variables and environmental variables. But one big issue with a lot of these studies is that they really are just correlations. And you can essentially take any environmental or cultural variable and relate it to whether a language has certain sounds or certain words. And now economists, for some reason, have really discovered this. And there are a lot of recent papers where they say, for example, things like that Greece has problems with money because the people don't have future tense in their language, so they can't think about saving and so on. And of course, claims like this are really problematic if they are just based on a simple correlation, right? So in evolutionary linguistics, we had a lot of discussions in recent years about how to avoid these types of spurious correlations. And this actually relates to the first plenary and the idea of drawing causal graphs. And so the idea is if you have a claim, like, for example, that humidity affects whether a language has certain sounds, which is a claim that exists in the literature, then really you want to draw the explicit causal graph of how these two variables relate and test every step and find supporting evidence to kind of back up this main claim. And we now have a database for this called SHIELD, where you can actually find these causal graphs and kind of also see the connections between different research papers and so on. And in my research, I've been using this. So we are kind of trying to combine different approaches and this causal graph approach. So basically starting at field side observations, so like seeing what's the diversity in spatial language and kind of describing this variation to see which environmental factors seem to correlate with certain spatial linguistic features, for example, and then we can identify the different social or topographic variables, like whether there are mountains or rivers or whether people are fishing, to then formulate specific hypotheses of how this could impact the language, which we can do in an explicit causal graph, and then we can actually test the links of these causal graphs using experiments or models, and the outcome of these models should then predict the patterns that we actually see in the real world. And this would then give a really conclusive story about the cultural evolution of these systems. And so I wanted to do this experimentally, and I also wanted to stop kind of studying spatial language on a small scale, because a lot of traditional studies have kind of used either tabletop tasks with lots of small objects or photographs to the extent that even the papers have tables in their name. And basically I say enough with the tables, and let's instead move on to like studying spatial language in its natural ecology, which is the large scale, especially if you're thinking about mountains and rivers and things like that. So for my PhD, I used a task where I basically designed two virtual environments, a forest and a mountain. And these were designed to kind of afford for different spatial affordances. So if you think about the forest, everything kind of looks the same. It's very difficult to get absolute bearings. So I thought that this could help prime an egocentric frame of reference, whereas the mountain slope has this very clear uphill, downhill, and a cross axis. I also put a moon and a sun into this environment that could be used to talk about the cross axis by saying something like moonward, if you wanted to. And the question is how sensitive is an existing language like English to these environments. And I created a VR app using Unity and the HTC Vive, where participants would spawn as these avatars with 2 hands in these different environments in a random location, and then they had to play a collaborative task that I call Orb Hunt. And this task has 2 players, one seeker and one director, and their objective is to collect orbs, and they get points for doing so. And the tricky thing is that these orbs have what I call area of visibility, so they are only visible to the seeker if he or she gets actually sufficiently close to the orb, so entering this area of visibility. And this is, of course, something you can only do in VR, right? You can't actually create an object like this in the real world, so this is really an advantage of this technology. And so this strategy is not very good, just randomly walking around until you find one, because they only have 2 minutes per round to find as many as they can. And this is where the second player, the director, comes in. The director can see orbs from any distance, but can't collect them. So in the real world, what he would probably do is to just point at the orb and say, go over there. But I don't want that. I want them to talk about the location because I want to get spatial language. It's kind of meant to elicit location descriptions. So I also manipulated the director to be invisible to the seeker. And this is, again, something you cannot do in the real world. But here, the director can see the seeker, but not vice versa. So he has to direct the seeker and tell them where the orb is actually located. And the idea is then that they play this experiment in one of these 2 environments for 10 rounds, and they switch roles every round. And the idea is they have then some kind of conventionalized strategy after 10 rounds of talking about locations in these environments. And the prediction is that if spatial language is indeed sensitive to the topography, then participants should use less egocentric descriptions on the slope. So less egocentric because they're English speakers that normally use or are known for using egocentric language like left and right. And I'll show you an example of here the forest environment and 2 participants playing in that environment.
Yeah, it's right next to that. Okay, if you turn at 180, and there's a big tree you can see, and go through that, and then beyond that again. And there's, 90 to your right, and let me get a little closer to you. Turn a little bit left, and then through that tree that you. Yeah.
Okay, and they collect the orb successfully. And here's an example of a pair playing on the slope. In the previous video, you might have heard that they used terms like turn to the left, go to the right, and so on. Here's a pair playing on the mountain.
Pull the trigger to continue. Okay. Hi, I'm director. Okay. Can you face down the slope for you? So,
right.
Yeah, that's right. Go forward about 3 times.
Oh, I saw it.
Yeah, you need to go back once.
I saw it somewhere.
Back uphill once.
All right.
You're closer now. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, and they managed to collect the orb. And you might have heard that they here actually use terms like go back uphill, go downhill, and so on. So if we look at the performance in these different environments, the game is exactly the same. It's not harder in one environment or the other. They collected, on average, 39 orbs. But they use different language to do so. So in the slope environment, they use significantly more actually allocentric language. So even though English has a very strong bias to use left and right, they actually picked up on these environmental cues, showing that it does indeed adapt to the local topography. And you can still see that if you look at individual pairs, some actually look like in the forest environment. So it's totally possible to mostly use left and right. But on average, about half the descriptions of the people playing the slope were actually these allocentric environment-based descriptions of location. In a second experiment, I then wanted to see how flexible these strategies are if people actually switch environments rather than just staying in the same environment. So we used the same game, but after 5 rounds, people would switch, for example, either from the forest to the slope, or in the second condition, from the slope to the forest. And this looked like this, that once they finished round, there would be a message popping up saying, next round you will switch environments. And then once both players confirmed on their controller, they would then move on to the next environment where they would start the next trial. And the prediction here was then that if left-right is more flexible, which is one of the hypotheses about that maybe it's more adaptive to lots of different changing environments, we should see dyads in condition 1 retain their strategy. They could simply keep using egocentric on the mountain, but in the other condition where there's no uphill-downhill axis available in the forest, they should simply switch to the egocentric strategy. And the latter we find, so if people go from the slope to the forest, indeed, they switch to the egocentric strategy, but we still find a switch also if they start in the forest. So it seems that if they're using their native language that affords for both strategies, it just readily adapts to the environment that's available. And so there's no advantage for one system over the other. So because they were just using their native language that can already do it, and it's not really a conventionalization, I wanted to then actually explore what happens if they have to create a communication system from scratch. And so this is something we do a lot in language evolution research, that we use a technique called experimental semiotics, where people have to solve a communicative task, but they can't use their native language. They have to create some kind of semiotic system to do so that we can then start to learn something about how human cognition and so on shapes communication systems. And so in my case, they had to communicate using signals or symbols. And in a pilot, they looked like this. I just gave them this arbitrary symbols that are easy to recognize because of their different colors and shapes, but they don't really mean anything. They have to kind of ground the meaning. And in the pilot, it turned out that it was extremely difficult to do this, to just use these symbols to talk about locations, because they have to somehow first ground an agreement, because they can't use their language, to what each of these symbols mean. So in the actual task, so they could send these symbols to each other, just selecting them on their controller and then sending, and then they would pop up in the headset of the other participant. And in the actual task, I changed the symbols slightly, that some of them remained arbitrary and some I made slightly more iconic to make it easier to ground what they could mean. So for example, this one could maybe be used to talk about a tree or the sun, and these triangular ones I kind of created to make them seem like uphill, downhill, for example, if you wanted to. And the game was the same as experiment 2. Participants played orb hunt and they switched after 5 rounds. And the prediction was then, due to there now being a cost to kind of renegotiating what these symbols mean in a different environment, I now expected to get this advantage for the egocentric system, where if they switch from the slope to the forest, they switch systems, but if they switch from forest to slope, I would expect a retention of the egocentric strategy. And this would suggest that egocentric is indeed more flexible or kind of robust. This task was much harder than the original experiment, obviously, because they couldn't use language. But you can see that a lot of participants managed to solve it, except this one single pair that actually didn't manage to establish successful communication. So you can see over time, most pairs managed to get better and better and collect more and more orbs. And there were even 2 pairs that were as good as using natural language. They just created a very seamless artificial language, basically, to talk about space. Then, of course, I needed to analyze these signals and understand like what frame of reference is actually expressed by them. And for that, I started with a qualitative questionnaire to just get an idea of what the strategies were. So I asked people to kind of fill out a questionnaire of what each signal that they used meant. But of course, this is not a very objective way of analyzing the data, because they might misremember, or the meaning of these signals might change over time. So for the actual statistical analysis, I developed a quantitative way of inferring what frame of reference actually underlies a specific signal. And for this, I used the movement data in the VR. So this is another advantage of VR, is that you can measure at basically 60 times per second for every frame, where people are looking, where they are positioned in 3D space, and so on. And so what I did is I used the signed angle between where they were looking when they heard a symbol and where they would then subsequently move. And you can use basically trigonometry to then infer this angle. And without going too much detail about the math, it's basically if you, for example, see this symbol in your headset and you were looking here, when your partner sent that, and then subsequently you would move up here, I can get this angle. And this tells me something about where they moved, because I can then compare this angle to two coordinate systems, the egocentric coordinate system, which is the 360 degrees, or the allocentric system that is based on the environment. So the idea is that if you hear a signal like this, and it's meant to communicate the orb is to your right, if the seeker is looking down here, and then subsequently moving here, then in the first case it might be ambiguous, because here it's also compatible with the interpretation that it means moonward, but over time they will use this signal again, and the coordinate systems won't always perfectly overlap. So it would be expected that it's more consistent here by always being around 90 degrees, no matter where they move. And so that would tell me that it's an egocentric system rather than a geocentric system. And by contrast, if they say something like the orb is downhill, the seeker is looking down here, then downhill would be here, which also happens to be the back, the 180 degrees. But over time, it should be more consistent with the downhill interpretation. So here, for example, in the egocentric case, it would be to the right rather than to the back. And so from these angles, I can calculate, using circular statistic, what is called the mean resultant length. It's just a measure of variance for circular data. So if you have angles that are widely spread, you get a shorter angle, shorter vector than if you have angles that cluster very tightly together. So this gives you some kind of idea of variance of angles. And so, for example, for this particular pair, using this orange symbol, I can then calculate what egocentric or geocentric system is more compatible with that. So you can see that in the forest environment, they tried using it, but it wasn't very consistent. But then in the slope environment, they managed, after the first try here, they managed to kind of agree that it relates to this direction here, which is consistent with the direction of the sun. So this tells me that they use this in a geocentric way. Whereas this signal that I actually try to kind of help them create uphill, they actually used it egocentrically to mean forward. You can see it clusters around 0 degrees. And vice versa here, this one, they actually used it for backward. It clusters around 180 degrees in both environments. And this is actually one of the big problems of this experiment, is that most participants really liked using these two signals for meaning forward and backward. So you can see there's a huge agreement across all dyads that played this game. And this was probably because the game was really difficult by just using signals, and they really liked having a neat way of just saying keep going or turn around. And often didn't develop so many more different signals. So if we then look at, because of basically the popularity of this strategy, if we look at the strategies in general, we can see that there's a huge egocentric advantage in both conditions and both block orders. And this even interacts with the time, that in the second block, rounds 5 to 10, the advantage of egocentric strategies even grows further. So overwhelmingly, people use egocentric strategies to solve this task with an artificial language. So in summary, basically, they rarely used allocentric systems because they mostly use these triangular systems to express forward and backward. And we had too few allocentric data points to detect a significant difference between forest slope and slope forest, so the order in which they encountered the environments. And so the potential reasons that I think for why the task ended up working out like this could either be that simply because the task was very difficult, the native bias became too strong. They just relied on the egocentric system because it's easier for them. But it could also simply be because of the way the game worked, right? It became very much about navigation rather than about like talking about locations between different objects. So in the future, I want to kind of do studies that are more about like talking about objects in relation to each other. But just to summarize for now, I think what this shows in the context of this talk is that you can really use virtual reality to study spatial language on the large scale, which is a huge advantage. We saw that experiment 1 suggests that actually topographic affordances do matter, that this could actually motivate these systems in the wild. So this is a nice kind of illustration for where these systems using mountains and rivers and so on could come from in the real world. And the hypothesis that left and right is more flexible could not really be supported in any of the experiments that I just showed. But we developed a very nice method for interpreting spatial linguistic systems that are used based on an artificial language just through movement patterns and using the data that's available in the VR. And this is really nice for conducting further research in the evolution of spatial language, to actually use these paradigms and this type of data, because it's very objective in a way. And yeah, I had planned a lot of follow-up experiments that were kind of halted by the pandemic because we can't currently test participants, but what I want to do in the future is test more different environments, also urban and rural environments, different city layouts and so on. And also test what happens if people actually have to develop a system, for example, to talk about the large scale, but then they have to talk about the small scale, because this might relate to these ideas about the importance of small scale objects in cultural evolution. And I also want to actually model the cultural transmission, for example, by simulating something like language contact. And yeah, finally it revealed the great potential of VR to study kind of linguistics. I now just briefly want to talk about something different, namely strange worlds. So while doing this, I actually discovered in a way that in VR you can really manipulate a lot of things that you normally can't do in the real world. So like, for example, making one person invisible to the other. And I realized that this actually has a lot of potential for probing the universality, robustness, or flexibility of language, in the sense that if you want to understand how language has evolved to fit our needs in the real world, we can actually look at a world that behaves slightly differently to learn about, how language can adapt. So I think about what philosophers call possible worlds that kind of differ from our own in terms of, for example, their physics. So you could vary the inherentness of certain object properties, like their shape, number, color, could constantly change in the VR. You could also do things with space, like create non-Euclidean space, or incongruent perspectives, like gravity could behave differently for one participant than the other. You can also mess with time. You could create a cyclical time where things repeat in a different way than it would happen in the real world, or which objects are permanent or dynamic. Or changing stuff like body parts, scales, to see, for example, if it affects the use of demonstratives and pointing and things like that. And to give you an example for why I think that this is useful, and I'm going to talk about noun phrase universals. So in the noun phrase in languages, if you have a case where you have a demonstrative, numeral, adjective, like, for example, these 5 big houses, most languages tend to put the adjective closest to the noun and the demonstrative furthest away. And it doesn't matter if the language is pre-nominal, like these 5 big houses, or post-nominal, like houses big 5 these, like a lot of Roman languages, for example. Most languages tend to use one of these 2 orders. So it has been discussed that maybe there's some cognitive bias for using this order rather than another. Now, the question that arises from this bias, of course, is this just something that is innate in our kind of biology or cognitive makeup, or is this something that is learned and that kind of results then through cultural evolution, for example, due to how the world is actually shaped, like the object statistics of how things appear in the world. Maybe color is just more inherent to an object than its demonstrative or how its number. And so we designed an artificial language learning task where participants learn by interacting with an alien world, a single noun and one modifier language, and it's post-nominal, so that they're not primed by their native language, which is English, which is pre-nominal. And they then have to basically interact with a world that is kind of strange in the way of how reliable or inherent the traits like number or distance, which is meant to simulate this or that, so the demonstrative, are to these objects. And the idea is that participants then afterwards have to produce the noun and 2 modifier labels, and we can then check whether the environment actually affects the order. So if number is more reliable, we would expect a kind of natural order that we see in real languages. But if distance is more reliable, we would see this more strange, exotic word order that doesn't really exist in real languages. And this would be a strong case for there being a bias due to the world. And we've run a pilot of this at a science festival in recent years, but we haven't run the actual study yet. But this is just as an example for how you could use these strange worlds to kind of ask very specific questions. So I just want to conclude in general, we've seen that VR has a wide range of applications of research because it allows for this unprecedented combination of experimental control and ecological validity due to its naturalness, its this high immersion and realism, and at the same time the tight control that you can control exactly what happens in the environment. And also it's open-ended. If you can think of it, you can create it in VR, including even strange possible worlds. And finally, it's fun and easy to recruit participants, which has been really helpful for me in conducting these studies. So I just, before I open the floor for questions, want to show you very briefly how to build your own VR experiments. I can't give you a full workshop, but this is just kind of a primer if you were interested in doing that. So there are some nice guidelines, for example, by Wasser and Aru, that I can quickly go through. Basically, the first step is to play some VR games to see how it actually works. So when I started out and I got the HTC Vive, it came with a what's called the lab, kind of collection of mini games where you could shoot a bow and like use the controller in different ways. And this was actually really useful because, for example, I liked the way that I moved in this game by using teleport. And it turns out that they also shared the code for this teleport system, and I could simply integrate it into my own game. And this was extremely helpful because then I already had a way for participants to move around, and I knew that it works very well because it's used in a commercial game. So by actually playing apps, you can see what works and what doesn't work so well, or what you as a user would like to see. Then you should be aware of dual realities. You should always think about what VR can do and what it can't do. So it doesn't necessarily engage the exact same cognitive processes as the real world. So visual input is usually primary. So if you're more interested in audio or something else, then you might want to use a different system. And also the mode of locomotion matters. So I used teleportation because it was easy and it doesn't make people sick. But if you want to, for example, measure how they feel about walking through a specific environment, then maybe you want to have them actually walk, because there are some studies showing that they can't judge the distance so well if they just point to where they want to go rather than actually going there. So you really should think of VR as an add-on rather than a substitution of reality, of how can you use it to improve your paradigms. And then you should choose your setup. If you just want to show videos, then you can use a 3 degree of freedom headset, but if you want to actually have people interact with the world, you should use a modern, like the Oculus or Vive, that also tracks whether people are moving up, down, forward, backward, and so on. So 6 degrees of freedom. And there are also different ways of tracking things, like in this case, it's just the headset that is tracking movement, but some setups have external sensors where you can also track the controllers in various fine-grained ways, which might be more helpful if you want them to actually interact with objects and so on. But this, again, might interfere with how your lab is set up, so you have to think about this in front. And you should also design human-centric, so you want to, of course, not make people feel ill. And this is, for example, where it's helpful to use something like teleport rather than them having press a button that kind of drives them without them actually physically moving, because usually this mismatch is what makes people sick. So if you really need them to walk, then maybe you should invest in a treadmill or a bigger area where they can walk. And there are also now tricks like giving them a virtual nose. So even though you don't notice it, if there's a nose kind of subconsciously present, it kind of grounds the visual system. You don't feel like a floating entity without a body, and that also actually helps to prevent motion sickness. And then you should make your games basically beautiful and playable. So the idea is that rather than having these very jagged edges, if you use modern rendering techniques like anti-aliasing, it also reduces the headache that participants get. And you can also use tricks, for example, by baking the light into the objects, so you don't have to render it in real time. It's not hard on the graphics card, but it looks really good. There are all these kind of tricks that you can copy from the game industry. And also, again, by playing games, you see how you can include menus or scores and so on to make the games playable and easy to use. And some other guidelines are that you should pick your participants well. So, for example, you should inform them that if they wear very large glasses, they might not fit under the headset. Usually, I tend to explain participants that if they suffer from vertigo or motion sickness, very easily, they should participate, because I wouldn't want to put them on a scary mountain if they don't enjoy that. And you should often test as you develop by basically going in there or having people try out your app, because it's always very difficult to see how people will actually react when they're in the VR. You should definitely freeze updates, because these modern game engines, they develop very fast. And in 2020, I was still using a version from 2017, because it would have broken all my code if I had updated, because they constantly release new stuff. So this is something to be careful about. And then be realistic about what you can do, what you can't do, to kind of study real-world phenomenon in VR. And finally, foster replication is basically the idea of open science, that you include also in your studies how big your play area was that you used and so on, and share your code so that other people can reproduce exactly what you did. And yeah, then basically if you want to set up your own lab, you just decide on the kind of play area that you need for your particular experiments. So for example, a standing setup or a larger setup where people can actually walk and move around and use controllers. So this might depend on the space that you have available. Then you choose your devices and tracking solutions. For example, the lower one could be an Oculus or HTC headset that comes with some controllers. And then you choose a development environment. And here, I would definitely recommend Unity, because it's very easy to learn. And it has this very nice interface where for VR, for example, you can use the Steam VR plugin that already gives you this play area that participants then see this blue square on the floor when they put on the headset. And it comes with the full support for the headset and the controllers appearing in this scene. So you can design some game scene and just drag this in, and it works right out of the box. And it already comes with scripts, like here on the right. It's a teleport script attached to the controller that has exactly this functionality of teleporting around that I used as well. And then you can use C# and Unity to create your own scripts and kind of create some logic for your game. And if you've done some object-oriented programming before, like Python or R, it's actually very easy to learn this because they have a lot of high-level functions, like here in this case to create a movement in the player that gets updated on every frame. But you can also work with the game developer and collaborate and have someone else program this, of course, for you. And then you create your experiment in the same way that you would create any experiment, hypothesis-driven, and simply implement that in the 3D engine, testing at every stage to make sure that it works, and then rely on existing resources. So I didn't create everything myself, like the trees and so on. You can find databases of objects that you can simply use for your experiments. And I put some resources up here. I'm happy to share these slides as well, where you can get the game engine, these different databases for objects and plugins for creating headset menus or teleport systems and so on. And also on the Unity asset store down here, you can also even find ready-made scripts. For example, the mountain I created using an erosion plugin that allows you to create these terrains and so on. Yeah, that's just a short primer. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to some questions if we have some minutes left.